You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making.
Hello, welcome to the latest episode of the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm Paul Smith, a senior economist at S&P Global, and today I'll be looking into recent trends in our closely watched Purchasing Managers Indices. To help me in that quest, I'm joined by two other senior economists, Pollyanna de Lima and Andrew Harker. Firstly, hello to you, Polly. Welcome.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me back to the podcast. This time around, I'll be talking about some of the PMI results for LATAM, business expectations, and firms' plans regarding investment in artificial intelligence.
Excellent stuff. We look forward to getting into the details on those topics. And taking a step back from hosting duties on our previous PMI podcast, hello to you, Andrew.
Hi there, Paul. Thanks. Great to have you back hosting as the compare without compare. Takes a bit of pressure off me this time. I can just chip in with the odd comment here and there. Probably summed it up pretty well, I think. Looking forward to talking about what businesses are planning and thinking about as we head into 2026.
Excellent stuff. I think before we get too deep into those topics, I'd like to do a little bit of scene setting, I think, given recent global economic performance. I think that's always a good place to start. So at present, global economic growth has, I think, proven remarkably resilient, given what has been, shall we say, an uncertain and at times challenging business environment in 2025. So just using the lens of the PMI through our JP Morgan Global Composite PMI, which ultimately summarizes all the responses we have from our 27,000 plus companies that we survey each month. In October, that index recorded a level of 52.9. That was up from 52.5 in September. So in context, that 52.9 is what we would call solid growth. So just remember, with PMIs, any reading above 50 is indicative of growth. Anything below 50 is indicative of a contraction in a particular variable. So when we take that latest PMI numbers and we maybe track it against global GDP, which is a pretty common use case for our surveys, given their long, rich history and track record in correlating with the global business cycle, those recent readings have been broadly consistent with above-trend expansion of the global economy. And that's partly thanks to solid demand developments as measured by our data and order books, which showed the strongest growth in new business for nearly a year and a half in October. Now, I think looking from a demand perspective, that's a decent result for the global economy. But I think if we dig a little bit deeper, which we tend to do as economists, we actually see a few headwinds that I think we'd all probably recognize from the news flow this year. So export trade remains quite soft. That's largely due to tariffs and trade uncertainty. And from a labor market perspective, employment, though it's rising, is only doing so slightly and at a below trend pace. And I think what's most notable at the moment is that business confidence is historically low. When we're asking companies about their thoughts on future output trends, global business confidence is actually amongst its lowest since the pandemic.
These are interesting insights, but we see some of these trends among manufacturers in Latin America. In Colombia, firms signaled substantial expansion in order books and production in October, which in turn supported job creation. The sector is still benefiting from interest rate cuts last year and in early 2025, which is supporting household consumption and demand. But also a lack of price pressures there due to better exchange rates means that firms can price more competitively and get pending contracts approved. Now, there is a mixed picture in Mexico. Production has fallen each month since the middle of 2024. Companies there are facing high cost pressures and a reluctance among clients to approve projects. In the anecdotal evidence, we also see that tariffs are having a detrimental impact on order books. But there have been tentative signs of improving sales and considerably softer contractions in exports relative to earlier in the year. What seems to be having a positive impact on demand is interest rate cuts. Now, in Brazil, production remains in contraction, ongoing declines in total sales and new export orders. Jobs there in the manufacturing industry have been shed at the fastest rate in 2.5 years. What firms have been telling us is that challenges are arising from constrained spending, elevated interest rates, weak demand, and tariffs.
Thanks, Paul. That's a really useful, isn't it, overview of what's going on now, today, current trends, which the PMIs are absolutely outstanding at doing. But I can't help but start to think already about next year. We're coming towards the end of 2025. It's mid-November already, and the end of the year is already in sight. And given this is our kind of final podcast of 2025, I think it's a good opportunity to maybe think about some of the themes and trends to look out for in the next 12 months. And I think the timing is good in that sense, as we've just recently completed and released our Global Business Outlook surveys, which, unlike the PMIs, which are predominantly based on current business trends, the Business Outlook surveys tends to ask firms about their expectations for things like business activity, employment investment plans, price expectations, etc. So I think it'd be good to maybe spend a little bit of time looking at Business Outlook survey results. And maybe, Polly, you were talking there, weren't you, extensively about Latin America, and maybe more specifically, we could look a little bit more at Brazil and maybe looking at the outlook from that perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Firms in Brazil still foresee growth for the year ahead, but there were widespread declines in business sentiment. So, for all of the 8 metrics tracked by the survey, business confidence were at their lowest since June 2020. Confidence, for example, around business activity, hiring plans, profitability, and investment. With the survey, we ask firms to list and identify those potential challenges and opportunities to the outlook. So, what featured in this anecdotal evidence for Brazil is that firms were worried about high interest rates, and in particular about next year's elections, which they think will add to the uncertainty. Tariffs again feature heavily in the anecdotal evidence, but yeah, there were pockets of mentions about competitive pressures, constrained investment, shortage of skilled labor, very high tax burdens, and the entry of cheaper products into the domestic market.
Yeah, perhaps just to build out, I guess, from the Brazil data, we can look at the picture more wide on the global scale, because we ask these business outlook questions in a number of countries around the world. What we see at the global level is quite a stable optimism overall. Actually, if you look back to the June survey, which is the last time we did business outlook before this October reading, we see that actual business activity sentiment hasn't changed really at the global level. And that's quite similar to what we've seen through 2025 overall. It's been a wait and see year in some respects, with companies holding off and waiting to see what happens with things like the tariffs and geopolitical issues and various other things. We also see that the impact that has on confidence around employment and investment plans. Again, not much change here, but leaving sentiment in those areas at quite a subdued level. So, for example, employment, again, confidence same as it was back in June, but that's among the weakest we've seen since we've been calculating this global data, which started back in 2009. And then if you focus on something like capital investment, sentiment there actually fell and was the lowest we've ever seen, apart from just during the pandemic. So yeah, overall quite subdued plans around employment and investment, probably a key feature of the latest business outlook data.
I think what we have with these business outlooks, so is in our PMIs in general, and we've hinted already at this, is we really do, outside of that kind of quantitative responses, do you expect output to be higher or lower in the year ahead, is that we are asking firms to tell us directly what they see as maybe opportunities for business expansion and perhaps slightly less positive challenges to their business in the year ahead. Polly mentioned some local factors there in Brazil, elections and tax burdens and things like that. I wonder, Andrew, whether you maybe could just help us a little bit here, maybe go through some kind of common themes that we're seeing around the world, both from that kind of headwinds stroke challenges perspective, and then maybe a little bit more positively, the opportunities for growth in the year ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can actually make use of a bit of AI here, and we're going to be talking about that in a second. But yeah, we've been able to use that here because I've got a colleague who's a bit of a whiz with the old AI, and he's been able to gather together all the reasons that we get from around the world, thousands and thousands of them. It's quite hard to go through them individually, but using our sort of in-house AI system, we've been able to categorize them and analyze them, put them into pots and see which ones come up most regularly. As yourself and Polly mentioned, we get two types of anecdotal evidence when it comes to business outlook. We get challenges and opportunities. And so starting with the challenges, familiar themes really. The main one that came up was economic and political instability. Makes sense. Also got tariffs and trade, still a fair amount of uncertainty about how that's going to impact things going forward. Also, inflation as well was mentioned by a number of firms, and that was borne out with the business outlook data as well. The indices we've got around inflation still quite elevated, especially compared to what we'd just seen pre-pandemic. A bit more positive in terms of the opportunities, market expansion and hopes for economic recovery were key among those, but also firms looking at investment, innovation and technology. So while I said earlier that actually the investment outlook's quite subdued still, I think there is a recognition there among companies that if they could find the resources and to put into those areas, then that investment, innovation, technology do provide an opportunity for growth.
I feel this is a nice segue into a deeper discussion around artificial intelligence use, and it's great to hear how we've been using that to prepare for this podcast and using it to analyze lots and lots of language-based information and how it can be used in that context. I think, as most of us are aware, the kind of investment and capital being committed in this space considerable, and in some respects it's that level of investment offset arguably some of the more adverse headwinds that the global economy has faced in recent months. But as we're already hinting at, we feel like we're moving to a different phase now with kind of AI. We're more becoming more concerned with the application and usage of these tools. How are firms using these new technologies? How do they see AI and how that's actually impacting their business performance? I wonder if this is an opportunity for yourself to maybe just spend a little bit of time using any evidence that we've got to help answer some of those questions.
Yeah, good point, Paul. So this October, when we conducted the business outlook surveys, we also asked firms globally additional questions about past and planned investment in AI and incorporated some case studies to gather additional insights from panelists into how they are using it, for example. What we see is a bit of a mixed picture in terms of small and large firms. A lot of it seems to be around making manual processes more efficient, like bookkeeping, meeting minutes, preparing documentation, doing some market research, and checking ideas. And small firms generally are reporting to us they are paying for premium accounts with existing conversational models. When we get to larger companies who have the ability to develop bespoke AI systems, they use it more to help with staff recruitment and customer acquisition, automation, and price value analysis, for example.
Yeah, these case studies have been quite a useful addition, I think, to the survey this year, improving our knowledge about how firms are using AI. We also asked them about the challenges that they're facing, which again is quite interesting as well. So some of the key things that have come out of that, I think, are probably familiar themes really. People talking about some maybe doubts about the accuracy of what AI is delivering and how easy that is to check and verify, as well as some challenges around the implementation can sometimes be quite time consuming, difficult to implement in the first place. So it'll be interesting to see how firms work through those challenges and as the technology develops further as well.
If I may add, in addition to the case study, we naturally have the data for all of these countries. And what we see in the data for this year is that the proportion of firms investing in AI rose since last year in all countries and sectors that we surveyed. And they are generally looking to increase further over the next 12 months. Confidence on this strengthened since 2024 in all countries and sectors. We can also break down the data by company size, which says a consistent story. Past and future investment in AI rose at small, medium, and large firms.
Yeah, I was looking into the data myself actually, and one thing that sort of stood out to me was the accuracy of firms' forecasts about their AI investment plans from last year. So obviously it's great now we've got 2 years worth of data here. We can see how the trends have developed over time. And what I found quite interesting was that if you look at the proportion of firms that said they were planning to invest in AI over the year and now see what they've actually done this year, then they're actually quite accurate. For example, in Germany services, last year, 58% of firms predicted that they were going to invest in AI. And this year, we surveyed them again, and it turns out 57% have invested. So, or pretty much spot on. I think that kind of gives confidence as well that the forecasts that we see from firms this year are probably going to be accurate as well. So, again, feeds into that narrative of just a gradual ramping up of investment in AI.
Since you mentioned Germany, let me just add the top countries for AI investment are in Northern Europe. So they include Germany, Austria, the UK, and the Netherlands. And this is the case for investment in the past 12 months and also planned funding for the upcoming year.
Yeah, that's a good point, Polly. I wanted to talk about also the impacts that this investment is having and expected to have, because we also ask about that as part of these special questions. We ask about the impact on productivity, revenues, and employment as well. And it's really productivity that's seen by firms as the main sort of result of this AI investment. If you look globally, almost 60% of firms are expecting an increase in their productivity over the course of the next year as a result of this AI investment. And looking through the data, it tends to be those economies which are most likely to have invested in the past, most likely to see the gains, which I guess makes sense, doesn't it?
Going back to the case study, we checked with firms how they are reskilling employees to work alongside AIs and what their hiring priorities are, for example. And again, among small firms, what we see is that internal training and workshops are mostly used to train current workforces, and firms generally haven't included AI in their hiring plans. What they reported to us, they often intend to develop these skills internally. Now, when it comes to large firms, they have dedicated teams to support the implementation and training of AI. They often established AI agents, employees who receive external training and then teach their core workers. And they are seeking to hire, for example, developers, IT, candidates with the knowledge of data processing and programming to manage AI initiatives.
Thanks, Polly and Andrew, for that. It was I think, an interesting discussion. Just hearing the contrast between usages in small and large companies, challenges in applications, implementations, but then hearing that the take-up is increasing. And you know what I'm like, we've got an emerging time series there. We've done it in 2024, 2025. I'm already looking forward to seeing how these trends pan out in 2027.
And go see the data next year, Paul.
I think I'd be more than happy to help in that regard. And of course, having you both on the podcast again in a year's time to discuss these emerging trends and how things are developing in this particular space. But sadly, that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to both Andrew and Polly for your insights. Regarding PMIs, we'll be back on the Decisive podcast next year. So for now, it's a goodbye from us, and we look forward to catching up and discussing our data again in 2026.
Thank you for listening to the Decisive podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.